Hello.
Hello.
So Gethin, tell us a bit more about your project and how we're going to have a video, or?
Yeah, we will. I was going to do a presentation. Good afternoon, everybody. Pnawn da. My name's Gethin. I'm artistic director of Fran Theatre Company, one of the partners who came together to deliver GALWAD, of which I was then artistic director of the live elements of. I was going to do a presentation, but there's been quite a lot of GALWAD over the last 48 hours, I think. So I thought I would just talk a little bit about the project and how it came about before sharing the trailer. And then a little bit about how it played out. But essentially, we are a collective of organisations and individuals from across Wales who came together, led by Claire Doherty, to really be inspired by the Future Generations Act, which is a pioneering bit of legislation in Wales which places the future generations at the centre of decision-making today. And the question that we had really was going, how do you create an emotional connection to our future in order to really understand what those decisions are? And through a long process of devising with communities, with artists, with scientists, with researchers and partners like Disability Arts Wales and the Centre for Alternative Technology, as well as Theatre Practice, really came up with a single story that would play out over a week. And that story was one that asked what would happen if our future was calling us for a week. So through an electrical storm, that happened. But not only were messages coming through, there was also an individual, Eva, a 16-year-old from Swansea, who had swapped places with her 46-year-old self. And over the course of that week, we would see how that would unfold. So I think I'll play the trailer, and then I might just talk a bit about the transmedia and how that played out over 7 days. Do I need the clicker or something?
Oh, yeah.
Stories. I spent my whole life chasing them, looking for the truth. And when you look closer, that's when you find what has been there all along. The answers are there, which leads us here. The storm. Time cracks. A girl lost in time.
Woke up today.
I shouldn't be here. This is all from before, a long time ago.
Some kind of frequency.
It's happening everywhere.
Come and collide with me. It's ours to take. Open your eyes and see.
Forget the pollution that you caught in time.
Mae amser yn rhedeg allan.
Yo, forget the illusions, I'll come in with signs. I'm coming for what's mine.
I don't want to freak you out or anything, but a communication pathway is opened up between us and 30 years ago.
Hell yes.
Man, can you hear me?
Who would you talk to if you could talk to the past?
The future is here.
Thank you.
That's the trailer. And I think what I really enjoyed about the process of it actually was we started with that provocation of how you create an emotional connection to your future. But then that was interrogated and explored with communities across Wales, just looking at that with over like 300 artists coming together to make it, experts from globally actually coming together through world building to ask that question and form a story that we could then tell in a way that broke the banks of how we had been telling stories. So we really wanted to build on Wales's phenomenal expertise and experience in site-specific practice, community-based arts, broadcast and technology, and say how could a single story unravel in real time over 7 days and collide into people's lives, be that on socials or in the market or in a quarry, which we did all of. And so for the first 6 days, there were a series of site-specific performances that were live-streamed to digital platforms from across Wales following a story through, whilst online there was content and messages and videos and voices filtering through from 2052 in Wales. Until we got to the Sunday, which was day 7, when we took over through a partnership with Sky Arts, the channel for 5 hours, and collated all of that content. There was over 100 pieces of content which got collated together and braided together to create one story before live streaming through still using a one perspective, one shot, one take technique, and live streaming from a quarry and a lake in Blaenau Ffestiniog for the grand finale of it, before cutting at exactly 8 p.m. to a TV drama which showed us 2052 and what had been happening there over the course of that week. So that's how the story played out, and really feeling like it was happening amongst us, like it was real and it was happening online and on the streets. And that's how it came about.
Great. And Rachel, can you tell us about pollinations and your work at Peter and Paul?
Yeah, hi, I'm Rachel from Peter and Paul. We are a creative studio based in Sheffield. I don't know whether the press is going to come up. I've got a few visuals. So yeah, I wanted to start with a visual that was given to us, an early visual of pollinations, which was originally called the Forest of Imagination. And this came to us with the stat that 80% of the plants and flowers in our garden originate from overseas, and that's kind of where this whole idea started for Trigger, who are the organisation behind the event. And the brief that came to us was that the brand needed to be weird and bizarre, it needed to be positive and not kind of your well-to-do climate change kind of project. And where we landed with the kind of strapline and the core idea of the event and the brand was biodiversity. And with this is that diversity in our plants and flowers in our gardens, in nature, only makes it stronger, and so does diversity within our culture. It only makes it stronger, and to bring all these together in a city centre project is where we landed. We had other names before we got to pollinations, supernature, the biome, but why pollinations moved forward was because it was that kind of blending of people and nature, that dispersal of culture and ideas, of seeds and flowers. And so this is the brand identity, and it kind of started with these core images, these hero images that are kind of really bright, really colourful. It's the plants and flowers exploding from people's consciousness. You know, it really entwines those two ideas. And so that was before we even got the kind of digital project brief. The idea of the Pollinations project was that it was a community co-growing, co-sowing effort, and the brief to us for the digital project was, how do we take this onto a wider global scale? How can we have a community project that exists online as well? And so we came up with the idea of having a series of questions. People answer questions about their self, their relationships, society, their culture, identity, and this is all encoded, all of their answers are encoded in a digital seed, which they can plant in AR, and they get a flower that's completely unique to them. The way that the flower looks, the colours, the textures, the way that it moves, is all based on their answers. And these are some early visuals that we explored with artist Manuel Camino, and the point was to get kind of quite weird, hyper-realistic flowers that didn't need to live in reality. They didn't need to look like flowers that already existed. And some of the colours and the textures and the way that, you know, if you answer a question that shows you're quite extroverted or, you know, really happy or excited in that moment, they're quite big, bold, or if you're more thoughtful or quiet, the colours and textures might be more subdued. And a really important part of this project was a workshop that we hosted with quite a diverse group of people, you know, from different ages, different cultural backgrounds, different ethnicities, sexuality, from all over the world. They spoke different languages, and what we wanted to get from them was, what questions would you like to be asked about identity and culture and about yourself? You know, we wanted to make sure that it wasn't an extractive process, that it wasn't, nothing was confusing or upsetting. Everybody should have been able to answer these questions, and above all else, it should be fun, it should be interesting, it should be thought-provoking. And then we took it to the Big Bang Fair in Birmingham with a group of 11 to 16-year-olds, which are probably one of the most honest audiences you could get. And what was really interesting about this was to see how people would behave with the prototype, how they, actually to see people using the app in its infancy. It was really interesting because obviously it was all hypothetical before then. You know, some groups of girls would all gather around together and answer the questions like it was a kind of personality quiz in a magazine. Some of the boys took it off like over there just to play with the augmented reality bit. So it was really interesting to get all those different perspectives while we were still creating it. And this is just a little video of how the app looks now, how the virtual super garden comes together in that digital experience. Just wanted to show you what the physical installation, what the physical garden looked like in Birmingham if you didn't get a chance to go there. What was really interesting, I mean, we heard from one of the architects earlier on today on this stage, was it completely transformed a normally very dry urban space. You know, it started conversations around the rewilding of our cities, and the app as well. If you go on there and look at, you know, there's thousands of flowers that have been created all over the world. And we kind of saw this as a digital rewilding, and it started conversations about culture and identity and acceptance of these things that we hadn't been having previously. And yeah, I encourage you all to download it and have a play, and I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So in a sense, both of your projects establish kind of conceptual parallels between sustainability and inclusion. You're transmitting the voice of future climate refugees. That might be our future, actually. And you're building the virtual gardens across virtual and physical space. Why was it important in civic terms, in creative terms, to build these parallels?
Do you want to go first?
I think that, so one of the things I found most exciting about GALWAD was that it was a devised process. Like, I'm a total theatre maker, and it was devising at scale. And there's been loads of talk today, which I've really enjoyed, around experts in their field coming together and all of a sudden being out of depth or in limbo or not the experts anymore. And that place, I think, is an incredibly exciting place to devise from. And that's what happened for a few months. And there was challenges in there and moments of real breakthrough. But it became a think tank of conversation and of creating and making constantly between artists and communities. And between all of the partners, we had access to an incredible collection of people from across Wales with a real broad range of experiences. So whilst our first question was, what does the future mean? And what would you do if you could be in touch with it? What does that feel like? What would you say? Or to put it in context, if you could talk to 1992, what would you say? And when you start to think about what that kind of moral responsibility is, a really exciting conversation starts to unfold. And I think in the way that devising works best is that it's about deep listening to what's being said and what's happening and what's coming through. And this was at a time when, of course, we were actually working remotely predominantly because we were in lockdown. And the conversation with all the young people, so Fran is an organisation that works predominantly with young people in rural areas. And alongside Disability Arts Wales and the conversations that we were having there, and Citizens Cymru, who work with young people across Wales who have experiences of migration and or racism, what was coming through everywhere was the inequality and the structural problems that we are existing within, and how they have to change as we look to 30 years in the future, and that being at the forefront of every conversation we were having. Now that, alongside conversations we were having with amazing researchers and scientists at the Centre for Alternative Technology, who were saying the next 30 years and the decisions we make are key to what our country and our world will look like in the future. So bringing those things together and realizing they are of the same conversation became the foundation to the whole project, really, and the whole world that we built for 2052. So through all of that research, we got to a place of going, okay, if in 2052 there's been a 1.8 degree increase in global temperatures, and therefore mass migration from the global south, lower-lying countries in Europe, and much closer to home as well, that means our society looks very, very different. So what does that mean? And that became a conversation, a second phase of conversation between those communities and artists going, okay, Wales, what does that mean linguistically, culturally, in terms of housing, in terms of employment, economics? And so I think to answer your question in a very roundabout way, it came about organically, really, through leaning into the the conversations we were having with communities and artists and truly listening to what needed to be said and explored within that time frame of 30 years.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, you say that organically came about. It was the same with Pollinations, the creative director of Trigger. It was also a lockdown kind of project that came from spending lots of time in the garden and being a very research-focused organisation. She wanted to find out where those plants and flowers came from and what that meant for migration and how those two were intrinsically linked. And yeah, it was about celebrating that. So how can we find a way to celebrate and, you know, shout about it? Not many people knew that fact about, you know, the English rose being, I think, from Kazakhstan. And she thought about how she could celebrate, you know, multiculturalism through horticulturalism and in a city centre environment that doesn't normally have, you know, have such greenery, have such focus like that.
Great. Yeah, I remember when I went to Pollinations, I had the feeling it's what we call in post-colonial studies a third space, because it's crossing all these cultural boundaries. And you talk a lot about communities, but what are the participatory methods that you used, and how can we ultimately use creative technology to empower and inspire communities to use media and technology as forms of self-expression, self-representation?
Yeah, I mean, participation evolved the whole way through. So from those initial conversations through the networks we were having, it was about conversation, but then that changed as we got, or evolved as we got into world building, which I know was spoken about yesterday, where communities across Wales collaborated with Experimental and Alex McDowell and the process he has of creating worlds. And through that act of collective imagination, the role was to engage in storytelling in order to build that future world. And then from that point, it became something slightly more informal, actually, about, actually in Blaenau Ffestiniog, where we worked for the majority of the time, and then after the finale happened, from that world building process, it became literally about sitting around a fire once a week and chatting about what was happening with the project and what was happening in the town, and feeding that into Thomas, the character on that video who introduces it, was completely formed out of those conversations around a fire. So he is a manifestation of those conversations that were happening and a representation of those voices and communities. And then in terms of how that then you empower we aimed then to empower communities to engage through different medias. What we defined at the beginning of the year, actually, we got to a point where someone spoke earlier about when technology feels like sometimes it can get in the way. And are you honouring the story at that point, or are you doing it for other reasons? And at the beginning of the year, we honed ourselves down and we went, our core principles with this story to help with that is going, it has to feel like it's happening now, and it has to feel in the real time. And when we did that, we realized that it needs to be a single story that is happening, as opposed to multiple stories that are taking place and you can scurry through them. But what we wanted to ensure that reach and reaching out to different communities and different audiences, essentially, was having as many touch points and access points to that story as possible. So be that live performance, broadcast, radio, whatever that might be. But what we saw happen then was audiences becoming actively engaged in the storytelling and the growth of this story because it was coming out through so many different channels.
And yeah, the participatory methods for us were partly that workshop that I mentioned earlier, and some of the things that came out of that, we wanted to know what did people want to be asked about their cultural identity. And some interesting things that came out of that were things like, we don't want to answer questions about, straight labels about I identify as this or that. It's more about, it'd be more interesting to ask people how they feel about certain things, or do you consider yourself a brave person? Do you consider yourself to be quite supportive, or do you support others? And that kind of question on supportiveness came from someone who really got into the idea of linking people and plants, and he was saying, some flowers and plants that need a lot of care are considered more beautiful and more precious, whereas in kind of human terms, he's thinking around disability, said it doesn't work that way. We're not given that same level of consideration a lot of the time, especially in kind of government policies. So there were really kind of rich conversations that informs the questions. And you know, by their very nature, the creation of your flower and adding it to the super garden is self-expression. You know, that flower completely represents who you are in that moment of time. And, you know, if you answer the questions on a different day, you might get slightly different questions. There's a good bank of them, but it will look different because you're not the same kind of day to day.
Yeah, great. When I was trying your app, and I thought, oh, that's so brilliant that you can create some kind of virtual bricolage. I thought that should be completely exported into our artistic approach of building our avatars in the metaverse. I mean, why would you need to have a 3D rendition of yourself if you can be a surrealist creature? And I always think that somehow the artistic imagination goes beyond the technological possibilities. I might be wrong, I don't know. Do you have any technological challenges when you are designing your projects and releasing them?
I mean, the artistic imagination on Pollinations was huge. The team that were working on it came from lots of different creative backgrounds in design, in engineering, in tech. So, you know, the challenge was, you know, there were lots and lots of ideas in the R&D phase around, you know, sound and around kind of gamifying the experience. At one point, we were going to have the flowers, if you got closer to them, they would emit their very own kind of unique soundscape based on your answers. And there was another idea about the flowers being kind of on a trail that you went to collect. So I don't know if anyone's ever played Pokemon Go, but in that kind of style. And the limitations with the technology, you know, we were using Apple's AR kit and Megaverse, our tech partners. They are here, they're in one of the expo rooms at the back, so any technical questions, please direct to them. But it was being done for the first time, a lot of the AR, you know, process. So we had to make sure that any kind of R&D was really focused on getting those flowers to look and behave in the best way possible. You know, we had to kind of really focus the idea and keep it on track to be about that self-reflection, about them representing a person. And I think it got to the point where if we had too much functionality, the experience would be diluted. So yeah, there were lots of considerations. And you know, even now, the technology, since we first started the project last year, is already moved on leaps and bounds. So yeah, maybe we can keep adding to it.
Yeah.
We had the same, actually. It's interesting, that thing of going, the same kind of thing of going, do you gamify or leveraging an audience's curiosity, and how do you do that? And we went down so many different rabbit holes before kind of coming back to going, what does this story need and what does this project need? And again, it came down to that idea of it being immersive and feeling real. And for that to happen, it needed to be appearing on someone's timeline that they were already scrolling, or it needed to happen on their street in front of them. So we then pulled away from that idea of an app or any sense of that Pokemon Go kind of avenue, and going, it's about utilizing the technology that people are using every single day and are living their lives on every day.
Yeah, and thinking of generations, I'm remembering last year's panel on the democratic potential of augmented reality, led by Angela Chan, when she was discussing that possibly there is some kind of new avant-garde emerging in augmented reality. And it's quite interesting that UNBOXED have actually developed 3 augmented reality apps that are in a completely different way reimagining our connection to place and people. And Rachel, why did you choose this kind of global approach of connecting diverse cultures, countries? I mean, it's really impressive as a project.
Yeah, I mean, the brief for the digital project was to build the Pollinations experience out so that it was as inclusive of as many people as possible. You know, if they couldn't get to Birmingham because of their location or because they physically couldn't get there, the team wanted to make sure that people could still interact with the themes of migration and culture and biodiversity. And so we looked to, you know, the idea of it being a community project. We wanted communities from all over the world to be able to do that. And if you look at the map of the flowers in the virtual garden, they are on every continent, they're everywhere. You know, there's some in the middle of the sea, I don't really know how it's happened. Maybe they're on a plane, who knows? But yeah, it was to bring in those global audiences to that physical environment.
Great. And how did you work across so many media platforms? You have cinematography, broadcast, social media. How do you build a story and an integrated creative experience?
Yeah, it's a good question that we wrestled with for quite a while. I think for us, it was about being, about nailing the story. So through all that, the collaboration and co-creation, a story was formed, and that had to become the Bible, essentially, that you could break off and splinter to different platforms. But that's what held it, and at the center of that, we really realized that you need a person, you need a human being who people are connecting to. And that's where Eva came through, really, was going, she is our bolt that can hold this for all audiences across all those platforms. And I think what happened as well was then we got the opportunity to commission a load of artists to then run with those ideas and to play with them in different formats. But what was holding everyone together was that idea of a single story holding it.
Cool. Although you have so many storylines,
yeah,
it was interesting. At one point, you're winning a World Cup, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's what was great. Is once, they did. I think Wrexham did. I think, again, once you had the story, you could split it out and go, right, the story that's happening in 2022 is our live story that is happening on the streets across Wales and is being live streamed. Great, that lives there. Then you've got, and that peaks at the point where we have this live finale from Blaenau Ffestiniog that is fully live streamed out to Sky. Then you've got, right, the 2052 part of the world. On what platform does that sit? And that became a film, essentially, that was fully leaning into broadcast and those skill sets. And then all of those beautiful monologues and messages that you've got coming through were about crashing into social media. And once you knew that what they had to be was a message from 2052 to today, built out of the world that had been created with those communities, it meant that those artists had total agency to go wherever they wanted. World Cups, languages, all sorts coming through.
Since you released also this super catchy track, are you going to win Eurovision? Yeah, I expected a message from that.
Can you imagine a Welsh song in Eurovision? I'd love that.
I'm wondering, Rachel, how did you design the augmented reality app in such interesting correspondence with the physical space? Because once again, it felt like a completely integrated aesthetic experiences. How do you make it across platforms?
Yeah, I mean, because we were involved in naming the project and branding it and bringing it to life on kind of social media and all the hoardings and all of the physical aspects of the event. We were already deeply immersed in the project by the time we started thinking about the digital companion to it. So for us, it was just about extending that to an online platform. It's what we do at Peter and Paul all the time. We kind of bring physical and digital experiences so that they're one. When people are in a shop or if they're in their kind of daily lives, they don't see these things in isolation. They experience everything all as one thing. You don't expect the digital world to feel any different to the physical in one experience or in one brand. So yeah, it was about just carrying on that kind of same visual identity, the same look and feel of the plants and flowers that were in there and being able to extend it further, the fact that the flowers are hyper-realistic. They don't have to look like the ones actually in the physical garden. We could be a bit more playful with it and really bring out the kind of emotional aspects of each kind of mesh and texture.
And what was the most interesting element in your collaborative process with Trigger? Because they're rather known as making theater performances. So how did you work with them?
I mean, it was genuinely one of the most collaborative projects that I've ever worked on. There were no no egos in the room. There was no one with one singular vision. It sounds really obvious to say, but everybody in that room, from kind of our perspective, from Trigger, from Unboxed, and our tech partners, Megaverse, we all had the shared vision of making it as good as it can be. And Trigger were really, really understanding of the R&D process, all these ideas that they came to us with the sound and the kind of gamification and all of these different things. When we explored them as much as we could, within time and budget, if we couldn't do it, we said, well, instead, let's put our energies and time and focus here. They were like, great, yeah, that kind of, they were on board with everything. Everyone was on the same journey. So, yeah, I mean, it was a brilliant project to work from our perspective and from theirs.
What do you think would be the legacy of your project, and how would they inspire your future creative practice?
My creative practice?
Also, yeah.
Yeah, what a huge question. I think, so to go back to your previous question, because I think it feeds into this as well, in going, how do you create cohesion across those projects, is, again, through leaning into that devising process and the co-creative process. I make work in Wales a lot, so it tends to be bilingual. And what I find really exciting is if you lean into those disciplines, a new kind of language emerges with that project. So with GALWAD, the trilingual nature of every scene, the integrated choreography, as well as the multiple platforms, meant that something new kind of formed in the way that, and the style and form of that story. And I think in terms of the legacy of that, what I hope to see in the short and medium term really is the collaborations that has sparked, the way of working that the artists and other members of the team take with them into future projects, and what can happen from the back of that. And the other thing really is looking at authorship within a project. GALWAD is authored by over 500 people, really. Well, more, actually, because I'd say it got to a point where the audience were also influencing the story, so then it becomes a much, much, much bigger thing. And that, I think, is an exciting thing when you're looking at a scene or a moment or a comment on a video and going, I don't know who authored this. Like, this has been co-created with thousands and thousands of people. And that, I hope, is part of the legacy going forward.
Great.
It's who tells the story.
Yeah. And towards conclusions, probably just to imagine, what do you think would be the future of live events? Merging community-led storytelling, live performance, transmedia, how do you envision?
I mean, I find, personally, I hope so, because I think it's really exciting. As someone during the pandemic, when things changed drastically in terms of theatre making and the use of, I think, broadcast and streaming within that was going, it's like when lights got introduced to a theatre for the first time. It's like endless possibility, and where could we go with that? And personally, I'm super excited by its potential to tell stories differently, break the banks of stories, and reach new audiences, I think. So yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, and yeah, I agree. I think there will be a lot more kind of blending and use of creative technology. But I think that we'll need to be careful to use it in ways that enhance the experience, and not just because it's new and because it's new and shiny and it's really interesting and fun to use. It's about using it in a way that kind of brings the experience to wider audiences and is more inclusive and can, you know, enhance the experience while you're there or even if you're not there.
Great. Well, I hope it was interesting, how our creative approaches to building live experiences. And yeah, let's continue the conversations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.